The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
What up, guys? It is the end of 2022, and it has been a wild ride. Let me ask you something. Seriously, do you want to know what they don't want you to know? In this video, I'm going to do my best to show you what I think the bigger agenda is for the Fed, for the government, and for all the alliances around the world, and how it will affect you. Many videos ago, as we were going through the monetary tightening with Jerome Powell, I had created a video, multiple videos, but I named one called the Fed Playbook. Historically and statistically, in a high inflationary environment, the Fed goes about its policy a certain way. There is reactions, there is actions, there is cause and effect. Many things happen from the beginning of the sequence to the end. We are not at the end, we are not at the beginning. However, we probably have peaked on inflation and the rate hikes are working. Inflation has come down. In fact, we've come all the way from 9% down to the low 7%. However, the Fed does not want the markets to go up. That is why the thumbnail says how the Fed stole Christmas. And I'm going to explain the reset and the agenda. They've done it for many centuries. Since the pandemic, myself and many others have wondered if there's a bigger agenda, from the world order to man-made chaos timed perfectly to create the perfect storm. But again, the real question is why? Just like the Fed playbook, I can show you how governments for centuries have engineered a way to take control of technologies. They did it in the oil boom. They did it in the railroad revolution. They did it with gold and just about everything else from then till now. Some of you may know, and some of you may not. Was Sam Bankman-Fried's involvement with Democratic leadership and the SEC much bigger than just some guy who ran a Ponzi scheme? Or was it known by them that it would fall to move the chess piece across the board for the real agenda? Just like the pandemic and vaccinations, people wonder if it's about control. Control to wear a mask, control to stay at home, control to take your weapons. And like the current narrative from the Fed, despite inflation coming down from 9% to 7%, which should be joyous, right? I mean, we've been worried about and declining in markets over inflation for nearly 2 years, guys. So why did the Fed steal Christmas? And why was the collapse of FTX timed so perfectly? And what is it they want to control? Now, Jerome Powell showed his hand several times, either with contradictions or flat out saying we want the housing market to come down and unemployment to go up. Ask yourself the question, why? If you're getting unemployment, you are trapped. They know how much you can spend to live, keeping you poor, controlling every aspect of your life. That is why they want more people to stop working. That is why the Fed signaled a scary narrative to bring markets down when the data shows progress. So what do they want? They want control. They want control of everything. They want control of your crypto. Again, why? Because the US running nearly a $30 trillion deficit and printing a new digital currency pegged to the dollar, still remaining king of the hill with the new world reserve currency, and meanwhile, with more regulation like KYC and centralized standards, and of course the added bonus to control DeFi is coming just as it has many times in the past. So like the pandemic and like regulations for cryptocurrencies, you need to ask yourself why.
Federal Reserve head Jerome Powell bombed financial markets with a speech last week. It could also bomb the economy. Jerome Powell delivered tough remarks about inflation. The Fed, he resoundingly declared, will raise interest rates until inflation comes down to 2%. It's more than 3 times that level today. Now here's the kicker. Achieving this goal means weakening the economy for a sustained period of time. He warned, quote, while higher interest rates, slower growth, and softer labor conditions will bring down inflation, they'll also bring some pain to households and businesses, end quote. No kidding. There in a nutshell is the big flaw in current economic thinking, that inflation can only be cured by depressing the economy and making people poorer. It is dangerous nonsense. Inflation is not caused by people buying too much stuff or earning too much money, as Powell and his fellow travelers fear. Inflation is brought on by devaluing the dollar, that is, making it worth less, by creating too many dollars. Fixing inflation means making the dollar or any other currency stable in value. We once did that with the gold standard, which we gratuitously destroyed in the early 1970s. Even though a sound currency is the right remedy, nowhere does the Fed, or just about any other central bank for that matter, even mention stable currencies. It's all about suppressing demand. Austerity is the order of the day. Powell professes to be guided by the lessons of the great inflation of the 1970s. Prices would rise, the Fed would tighten, and the economy would slump. The rate of inflation came down. Then as the economy recovered, it would rise again, worse than before, triggering another recession, and so on. Only a savage recession in the early 1980s, with sky-high unemployment, seemed to finally slay the inflationary beast, according to Powell's narrative. The conclusion? The Fed previously eased up too soon. That's why Powell vowed that wouldn't happen again. Quote, restoring price stability will likely require a restrictive policy stance for some time. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy, end quote. Powell is wrong. The reason inflation seemed so intractable in the 1970s was that when inflation came down after a recession, the Federal Reserve went back to printing too much money. The solution to monetary inflation is so simple: a stable currency.
I've never really been a believer in coincidence. Sure, it can happen as a fluke, sometimes, but if you look back just to the pandemic, and of course we can go back much further, I have to wonder if there are bigger forces at play. When 150 things plus go wrong, and every day is a new catastrophe for nearly 3 years, it begs the question, why? Sure, there are recessions and macro headwinds and economic cycles, but the agenda has always been control. Is it not suspicious that crypto's white knight Sam Bankman-Fried was the Democrats' second largest donor? Is it not odd that the Bahamian people were not allowed to invest in crypto, yet the Bahamian government allowed withdrawals for 25 hours to remove over 100 million in crypto assets from FTX? Is it not strange that Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested an hour after the document was filed in the Southern District of New York? Is it not strange that so much money has been invested into Ukraine, and why is that? Could it be territory, control, resources, and a wider destabilization of the global economy? I can go on and on with many examples, but I just want you to ask yourself why, and could there be a bigger agenda at play?
The Governing Council decided the following. First, we will continue to conduct net asset purchases under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program with a total envelope of 1,800 billion euros until at least the end of March 22, based on a joint assessment of financing conditions and the inflation outlook. The Governing Council expects purchases under the PEP over the next quarter to be conducted at a significantly higher pace than during the first month of this year.
What if the $120 billion per month and soon to be $7 trillion freshly printed by the Fed is all meant to cause hyperinflation, leading to the collapse of the American economy and a great reset that strips the power from the people and gives it all to the centralized financial elite. So sounds like kind of a bad dream, right? Well, no, this nightmare is happening now in front of our very eyes. Because as you're about to discover, within every major crash in recent history, there's a reset that triggers massive wealth transfer and further centralization of power. Centralization where the many are controlled by a few at the top, restricting ownership and freedom. And that's why President Ronald Reagan warned, quote, "Millions of individuals making their own decisions in the marketplace will always allocate resources better than any centralized government planning process," end quote. So indeed, centralization is the biggest single threat. See, according to the Center of Research on Globalization, this Great Reset is really about, quote, "permanent restrictions on fundamental liberties and mass surveillance," end quote. And it gets worse. Quote, "The World Economic Forum says the public will rent everything they require, stripping the right of ownership under the guise of sustainable consumption and saving the planet. Of course, the tiny elite who rolled out this Great Reset will own everything," end quote. And this is one reason why they want America and its economic freedom to collapse, because it serves as the last source of resistance, standing in the way of the Great Reset's plan for full global centralization power. And that's also why, before I go any further, I have to make it clear, the best of these so-called radical solutions not only disrupt centralized financial control, they solve every single one of its problems, from privacy and security to fees and high interest rates or any problem you've ever had with a bank or payments. They also offer the only hope for stopping this movement towards centralization and preserving the American way of life. Virtually no one believed that the world's largest mortgage bankers, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, would go bankrupt and crash the real estate market in 2008. Almost no one believed that the long-held American institutions like GM would go belly up soon after. And even very recently, virtually no one believed that our government would lock down the country, crushing tens of thousands of small businesses. There is a lot happening right now that was supposed to never happen here. So my advice is this: you must be prepared, because the writing is on the wall, and I can tell you with near 100% certainty that most Americans will not know what to do when the centralization reaches its final form. When everyday commodity prices, including essential staples like milk and bread and gasoline, when those prices go through the roof, they won't know what to do when banks close, or when their internet service or mobile phone is shut off, or when their credit cards stop working, or when they're not allowed to withdraw cash, or even not allowed to exchange digital currency. Some of this is already happening. There are an increasing amount of restrictions and regulations on digital currency ownership, and with the massive increasing levels of censorship, by the time we realize all this is happening, it may be too late. And just like it is in China, in North Korea, in America, without private property and without free speech, with forced medical procedures and no ability to earn, and massive welfare-like dependence on the government, this could all be coming to your city in the not-so-distant future. And in short, our way of life in America will be in for the most radical change that we've ever seen. And it's all because of centralization, unless we come together and stop it and chart a different path. And
When we talk about collective ownership, everyone will own together. The reality is that nobody will own anything but those that are in power. So if you take the largest corporations of the world and align them with the most powerful governments for a singular agenda, where they make all the decisions for the people, strip all your freedoms, will that make you happy? Founding father and first president George Washington of the United States said, "There is no such thing as personal human rights without property. If you are dependent on a greater power for everything you need, then you are not free."
It is essential to first understand what happened on this little island in 1910, because that's when some of the world's richest men and most powerful politicians met in secrecy. So at the time, members of the Jekyll Island Club owned 1/6 of the world's total wealth. Munsey's magazine called them the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. This included Senator Nelson Aldrich, a relative of Standard Oil founder John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller's estimated $1.4 billion net worth in 1937, that was equivalent to 1.5% of the US GDP. According to this metric, he was and still is the richest individual in American business and economic history, though he himself was not present actually at Jekyll Island. In fact, he's believed to be the puppet master behind the other 6 men there, who, during this exclusive meeting, created the Federal Reserve, which is the private entity designed to dictate preferred policy on the American money supply. This would not only ensure his future generations had access to unprecedented power and wealth, it would provide the perfect vehicle for full centralization of global financial power, which is history's ultimate power grab, and eventually set up what we know to be now called the Great Reset. And this is why current elites, including living Rockefeller descendants, recently gathered together to celebrate the creation of the Fed. And so with the groundwork that's been laid with the creation of the Fed and the rapidly growing wealth inequality in this country, it's clear that they're playing a sophisticated chess game, while the average American is stuck playing checkers. Because throughout history, we see their plan in action, hidden in plain sight. And here's how it works. Each time there's a crisis and a corresponding crash, we see a massive redistribution of wealth and power. And of course, it's always in their favor. For instance, just before the dot-com crash of 2001, the centralized financial elite invested heavily in pre-IPO unicorns like Priceline and Pets.com, eToys, Cosmo.com, and Urban Fetch. And then when the IPO day came and prices peaked, they pulled their early money out just before stocks lost 80% of their value overnight. And if you forget, Amazon lost 90%. And over $5 trillion in American wealth was destroyed, just as you can see here. So as you look at that chart, I want you to notice something. After this crash, we see a clear pattern. A rapid reset and corresponding boom, which is triggered then by the Fed lowering interest rates to stimulate growth back up. But who benefits from this rapid growth after the reset? Well, it's simple. Those who knew the crash was coming got out before it happened and bought up everything after at the bottom. It happens over and over. In 2008, the centralized financial elite again made early fortunes, but this time it was on subprime loans and corrupt financial instruments like credit default swaps. As Forbes wrote, I quote, "The underwriters of these made more than 12 million subprime mortgages with a value of nearly $2 trillion. The lenders who made these were exempt from federal regulations," end quote. They did so knowing full well that this would eventually lead to a crash, and crash it did. It precipitating one of the worst falls in American history. And that's when the Fed again intervened, and not only with an interest rate drop, but also a bailout. As the New York Times reported, quote, "The U.S. House of Representatives gave final approval Friday to the $700 billion bailout for the financial system, reversing course to authorize what may be the most expensive U.S. government intervention in history. And while the government and centralized financial elite were bailed out, hundreds of thousands lost their homes." So who was buying their homes? Well, you guessed it, the same centralized financial elite who just profited from the bailout. That was far from the only example of wealth transfer to the centralized elite. As Fortune noted, quote, "The totality of the Fed's post-2008 actions has resulted in a historic regressive wealth transfer from the less well-off to the well-off," end quote. Fee.org summarizes their scheme perfectly. Quote, "Once a boom occurs, tech bubble, a bust happens when interest rates are raised, the 2001 downturn. In order to get the country out of the downturn, another boom is created, the housing bubble, which leads to a bust, the 2008 crisis. Until central bankers abandon the boom and bust cycle idea, things are not going to change," end quote. But again, it's not supposed to change, right? This is all by design to lead us to the Great Reset, where they own everything. So look at what happened most recently. As Business Insider documented, quote, "On March 16th, 2020, just 5 days after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, the Dow suffered the worst single-day point drop in its history. But by June 4th, 7 of the world's richest people had seen their fortunes increase by over 50%. What in the heck made this possible? Another stock market rebound fueled by the Fed. Again, the Fed lowered short-term interest rates for banks to nearly 0%, and as before, they held those rates in place until the centralized financial elite had grabbed up the remains of their latest reset for pennies on the dollar. Worst of all, with each engineered crash and bailout that is in favor of the elite, the Fed printed historic levels of money, putting America into trillions more debt and accelerating inflation as well, where current inflation is over 5.4%, a 13-year high, while devaluing the dollar to the lowest level in decades and pushing us ever closer to the edge of the cliff that we know as the Great Reset. Now, with America on the verge of a new type of collapse, this final Great Reset will allow them to create a fully centralized, cashless economy that they'll control and exert more of a stronghold over the people than ever before, because the current financial system has not only riddled America with just an ungodly historic amount of debt, which is, leading to the absolute destruction of the middle class, where 33 million Americans are unemployed and just 39% of Americans can afford a $1,000 unexpected expense. But it also kept them out of many of the biggest wealth opportunities in history.
See, conventional economics knows the cost of everything, and yet the value of nothing. The idea to have a bigger slice of pie. But why pie when you can have an entire layer cake with so much more, like strawberries and icing, right? The fundamental layer of the cake is how the planet is doing by protecting resources. The next layer is how we take care of each other. Then we can build a physical infrastructure. And then finally on top, the economy, which we usually discuss. Nobody really ever talks about the layers below, but nothing stays intact without them. In the beginning of the 20th century, we started off with 2 wars and a depression. And at the end of the 20th century, people recognized human development and security was very important for the well-being of civilizations. Does human development create economic growth, or does economic growth facilitate human development? Since the 1980s, the primary focus was to grow the economy. You give the people that know how to make money more money to make the decisions for everyone. When they do that, they keep it under the cover of these people that they will help humans in total once they succeed. But once they succeed, they don't share. They keep it for themselves, and you're left with nothing. An argument for free markets without a robust public overwatch is an argument for inequality. We've learned that my survival is important and depends on your survival. Building up the layers of support will support the economy, paying people good wages, keeping innovation flourishing. Better public services will boost the economy from the bottom up, taking these freedoms away from people, leaving you with nothing. But then again, the World Economic Forum says you will be happy and you will have nothing. Did you know that the US dollar back in the early 1900s was actually worth a full dollar? But after the Great Depression and all the money printing from centralized banks over the years, it's actually only worth 4 cents currently. That's down 96% of its original value. One of the biggest problems is that we, the people, have allowed banks to print money at their disposal, which creates inflation, hurts your purchasing power, and devalues the currency. Because of banking and regulatory laws put in place, the banks are allowed to only hold a small fraction of your money that you deposit. Here's an example. You go to work every day, and on payday you go deposit your paycheck and maybe even have your 401k at the same bank. Let's say you deposit $100. Well, due to banking and regulatory laws, the bank is only required to hold 3% or $3 of it. Then the bank can lend out the other 97% of your money and collect interest, which you don't get any part of. A second loophole for banks is that they don't even need your deposits to do this. They can actually lend money to clients off what they deem as credit worthiness and write loans out of thin air. So not only do they make interest off your money and create money out of thin air with credit worthiness loans, which they pretty much write the rules on, they also, by doing this, create huge multiples of liquidity in the markets and economy. Since institutions and big money investors are allowed to do this, they have to sell quickly in a bear market because 97% of all their money is actually virtual. A run on a bank like FTX is what would happen to any and all banks due to these fractional reserve requirements or liquidity multiples that are not truly secured. Now, when central banks like the Fed or banks and lenders create money, it adds to the overall money supply and not only devalues the dollar, but it also causes inflation. Inflation is really hard on people because you pay your taxes once a year, but with inflation, you are paying that inflation amount in addition to the taxes every year. So when a centralized bank like the Fed starts a monetary tightening cycle, these banks, institutions, and lenders need to sell off assets quickly to deleverage all the virtual money that they lent out. Because as the assets they invest in start to devalue and the dollar is devaluing due to inflation, they also have to worry about people getting laid off or losing their homes and defaulting on these loans as well, since they made the decision to make the loan out of virtual money, and the possibility of default and worse, a run on the bank becomes more likely. As people will need their money out of the bank, it creates a perpetual sell-off. The entire money system is built on debt since the gold standard, and because the US debt is so high, it makes sense that the government would want to control your crypto. This may be regulation as Know Your Customer with KYC, but it could be much worse, like stifling innovation or not being able to purchase, trade, or custody your own crypto. You should ask yourself why. Why would the government take control of one of the last things people have left for a chance at wealth? When Russia first attacked Ukraine, all NATO allies showed their support for the Ukrainian people. And you can't put a price on protecting civilization and human rights. But if you could kill one bird, two birds, three birds, four birds, five birds with one stone, well, it certainly could be better. For instance, pumping a ton of money into the Ukrainian government to arm the Ukrainian soldiers and protect them from attack is good, but it also allowed the United States to remove the US dollar reserves from Russia, which sent the US dollar into a parabolic status where no other currency across the globe could catch up. It also sends Russia, once the Soviet Union, back to the Bronze Age, especially if the resources from that region eventually become the property under control by the majority of the Allies. It is and has always been about control and keeping people poor. The only problem is that it's getting much worse and faster with the Great Reset. We know that FTX lost $8 billion in user funds, but the government has actually made money at least 3 times that we know of off FTX. The first was in the BlockFi situation, the second was his bail, and of course the third was to Democratic donations. Chances are all these major expenses that the US government has benefited from come from user funds. I hope this video opened your eyes and at least got you to consider the question, why? Why are all these horrible things happening and keep on happening? It's a form of disaster capitalism and a move towards socialism. I believe in crypto, and I believe keeping it off exchange in your own custody is the right path. We will always pay taxes, but we should not have more freedoms, liberties, free speech, freedom of thought, innovation, and property ownership taken from us.